Let's have a seat. Let's have a seat. Hello, everyone. Well, all right. I get to preach this morning. My name is Cole McGee. I'm the associate pastor here, and it is a pleasure to speak. I feel as though ultimately my job is to pass the torch from one week to the next while Tim is gone. And so that's the goal this morning, is no one really to remember anything, and we just kind of move on until Tim gets back. No, I'm kidding. All right. Okay, I didn't expect that response. Okay. This morning my text is actually Luke 24. Luke 24. It's the road to Emmaus. You heard the text. It was a long one. And I think that this story is, am I a little hot? Can you bring me down? I can hear myself. Okay, there, perfect, okay. The road to Emmaus story, I feel like, is one of those stories that it's in the realm of like prodigal son territory, where it's a pretty famous story. It has it kind of teaches on its own. You can just kind of tell the story, and it immediately sparks your imagination on what the story might be. And for us this morning, what I'm kind of wanting to do is to walk through the text, walk through the story really directly, and kind of break it down, go section by section, and talk about it. And one of the hopes I have for this is that we get a sense of not only what the story is doing in Luke, but we get a sense of what the story might mean for us and what it has meant to the church for thousands of years. So this is my hope. So let's look at it. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. So the book of Luke pushes the resurrection story. The book of Luke is, as a gospel, is different than the other gospels. Every gospel is doing its own thing: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Luke is absolutely doing its own thing here. And it pushes the resurrection of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus, to really close to the end of the gospel itself. In fact, it's so close that essentially the end of the book of Luke is Jesus rises from the dead, the road to Emmaus story, the ascension of Jesus in like a few sentences, and then into the book of Luke. And so it's fair to say that this story, the story of the road, these travelers on the road to Emmaus, is a kind of bridge story that if you know what I mean, Luke, as the Gospel of Luke, is written by Luke, but so is Acts. Acts is also written by Luke. And so they kind of work as a two-part companion. And if you think that's true, which I think it's pretty much obviously true, the road to Emmaus story actually is extremely important, because it's one of you can write a lot of things in between the book of Acts and the resurrection of Jesus, and this is the story that Luke's like, we're going to put this here, and this is going to be the main feature of a transition from the Gospel of Luke to Acts. And this story, this one story, I think is doing a lot of work. And I think there's a ton packed in here. I really do. I think this story for the early church kind of took on a life of its own, right? Let's keep going. Jesus asked them, this is after the resurrection, so Jesus shows up, and he asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" Right? So the resurrection of Jesus is not some small story. This was like a huge kind of news moment in the day. And everyone is kind of talking about what has happened over the last few days. And so these two followers are leaving Jerusalem. They're going away from Jerusalem. This is key in the story. And I just want you to imagine the amount of time, the amount of energy, the hope that they have placed in the Messiah. And then they watched as Jesus suffered a horrific death by the empire of Rome and the Jerusalem elite. And these two were walking to Emmaus. By the way, Emmaus, a city that is very well known as a hotbed for revolutionaries, of violent radicals. Emmaus is one of those cities that you say it, you kind of know what kind of city we're talking about here. Emmaus was not messing around as a place. And so I'm imagining these two people, assuming they maybe live in Emmaus, whatever it is, the text is going, they're going to Emmaus. That should cue us into kind of the nature of these two individuals. Potentially former or leaning violent revolutionaries. And I'm imagining their fathers fighting in one of the past Jewish revolts, because this is Emmaus. That absolutely probably would be the case. And the Romans crushing every Jewish revolt throughout time. I'm imagining their fathers, fighting in this war. And now these two are walking and thinking about how they are taking their place, right, in the ancestral line of failures to liberate their people. The cynicism. And it's the worst kind of cynicism, not of just old age, but of failures, right, of unmet hopes, reminding them of all the things they said about past generations. So you guys didn't have it right, or you guys failed this, or we got this, we're going to do this differently. Past wounds, and now all of this has kind of happened to them. And this revolution was their responsibility now, right? And as they're talking, the resurrected Jesus comes up and starts talking with them. But verse 16 wants us to know they were kept from recognizing him. And I find that part, as I'm reading the text, that just leaps off the page to me. What does that mean? They were kept from recognizing Jesus. They could not see Jesus. They didn't recognize him. And so the question, what was keeping them from seeing the resurrected Christ? What was it? So I sat down this week and read the book of Luke front to back. Yes, you pay me to read the book of Luke front to back, to do things like this. And I will tell you, there is no way I'll stand on this, despite some 50 to 60% of commentaries I read. Look, I'm just me. I don't know. This is what I think. There's just no way what is keeping them from recognizing Jesus is God. It's just not God. That's not what the text is saying. The Gospel of Luke is no way sets up this story as being God that blinds them for Christ's glory to tell a story or later on. I know this is a common thing. I just don't think that's in the story. But Luke, though, throughout the book of Luke, is kind of obsessed with the imagery of sight and people and being able to recognize the imagery of open and closed. In Luke, there are 15 significant instances of Jesus doing something and then making a point that someone can't see or is blessed because they can see and they understand. The pattern as you read Luke is pretty hard to miss when you read it front to back. And if you don't take Emmaus just out of that book, I think it becomes pretty clear. Let me give you one massive example of this. Luke chapter 4. Right at the beginning of Luke, right? Emmaus at the end, Luke 4 is at the very beginning. This is the announcement that Jesus is, in Luke 4, Jesus is beginning his ministry, okay? This is Luke's account of what Jesus came to do. This is the announcement hey, what's up? I'm here. I'm going to do some things. And this is the story of how it all began. I think Shane Claiborne says this in the Sermon on the Mount is like Jesus' platform to be president, right? I love that. Luke 4. He went to Nazareth, Jesus, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's the announcement. And then he rolls up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, sat down. And eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, "Today the scripture is filled in your hearing." And just drops the mic, right? That's the moment. And at that point, everyone gets really mad and they try to kill him. It's a whole story. But what Jesus does here is he says, to set the oppressed free, the recovery of sight for the blind, for those who not just obviously not physically, it's metaphorical, they can't see. But I think Emmaus is just one final story to land the point that something is in the way of that. There's something in the way, right? And these disciples, again, probably these two travelers, if they were followers, obviously they know the stories of the inner circle by the end of the story. So these people were pretty close to Jesus. And they probably heard about Luke 4, the story of Jesus standing up in the synagogue and announcing what Jesus came to do. And so they were probably, by the way, all about it. They obviously followed Jesus potentially for up to 3 years, so they would probably know exactly what Jesus was up to. They would have heard, "I came to set the oppressed free, the blind to see." And they probably heard Jesus' platform, right? And they were like, "I'm all in. This sounds great. That's what I'm about." They've been doing this for 3 years. But Luke is making a point, a weird subversive point, a very direct point, I think, about post-resurrection, about what's coming in the history of the church, about me standing here teaching this, about you sitting there in the chairs, about the college students online watching this. I think what Luke is trying to say, that even the ones who hear and the ones who have even stood there at the cross and saw it happen are often still somewhat unable to see or understand what all this means, what the life of faith is. And I think Luke is saying being a follower of Christ actually has a kind of learning curve. Being human, as human was meant to be, is not necessarily just a default setting that happens once you download and update post-resurrection. I think Luke is kind of announcing or reminding everybody something is in the way. Something is in the way. "What things?" Jesus asked. "What things are you talking about?" "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed, before God and all the people. The chief priests and the rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." That word is actually a liberation word. It's not, we hear it often in terms of transactional kind of salvation, but it actually means to release or to ransom Israel. "And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus." So, well, obviously, right, in this part of the story, you could probably add things to the story in the text to make this a little more accurate, I guess. But I'd like you to notice that there's nothing that they said that is not true. There's nothing they said that's not actually, I need to correct this witness of your experience. This is absolutely true. There's nothing they said that's wrong, right? It's factual. It's accurate. It's a correct interpretation of the story of Christ as they're standing there. And they know the truth up to a certain point, but they don't quite understand it, even though people are telling them, right? And it's not, this is key, it's not just like they don't believe. These followers, I think, given their history and what this story is signaling to us, they're dying to believe. Like, they want to believe. This isn't some like rational, I need to see some evidence here. This is a different kind of conversation. They're wanting to believe. And the story is saying they don't recognize Jesus and something is keeping them from seeing. Verse 25. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets." Moses, that's a choice. Moses and all the prophets. He explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. I will tell you, this is just a side tangent. When this happens in the Bible, it always kind of freaks me out. I wonder if it freaks you out too. Whenever Jesus or someone in the New Testament explains the gospel using the Old Testament and nothing about the New Testament, because it's not written yet, this is like their Bible is the Old Testament, it always freaks me out because I'm like, how did they take the good news of Jesus? How does Jesus do this from the Old Testament text? Like, I find that to be a skill that is pointing to me of like, you still need to do some work, Cole. I think we all need to do some work to be able to understand what's happening here. But Jesus looks at these two people and he says, how foolish, how slow to believe. Slow, not that you don't believe, how slow to believe. Jesus is trying here to liberate these two travelers. And Jesus doesn't pray for them in that moment. He's like, hey, let me pray for you. He doesn't hold them close to his heart and hope for the best. Jesus begins a debate with them. He begins working to release them from what is in the way. There's some tension here in this story. And it's not some light story. This is an argument. Jesus is not like playing around. There's a push and pull. There's a back and forth. There's dialogue. There's drilling down and dynamic tension, trying to find a way for these two travelers to be liberated from what is in the way, to be able to see. Verse 28. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. So I'm telling you, I just want to like set this like feeling of this text. This isn't, hey, we love you. Come join us. It would be great to have you with us, Jesus. You know, this is actually more like, no, you don't get to leave. Back here. Get back here. We're not done with this conversation. We've got some things we need to get to the bottom of here. Come back to my place. I'll get a fire pit out. We need to hash some things out here. Because, I mean, remember, these people, these two followers aren't just like completely novices in the faith. They are disciples of Jesus. They're followers. They've given 3 years of their life. They potentially are related somehow to Emmaus. These people are serious people with serious ideas and probably ancestors who are willing to do unspeakable things for the sake of the liberation of God's people. That's historical record. I mean, what was it that was keeping these two people blind to the identity of Jesus? Like, what was it keeping them, these followers, from understanding, from making meaning of the last 3 years? Heck, like making meaning of their life, making meaning of their future. What does things mean now post-resurrection? And these followers who knew the truth but didn't understand it. And so as you read the book of Luke from beginning to end, it becomes quite clear to me that the point of the story, what is in the way of their ability to see Jesus, my proposal to you is that Luke is trying to convince the early church that what is in the way of our ability to see, to understand, is the overwhelming and totalizing violence and corruption of empire. That empire is at work constantly, and it's in the way often of seeing and understanding the stories, the text, and Christ. Let me give you a quote here. I was thinking to myself, we use the word empire a lot, and I want to use the Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, famous for the book Prophetic Imagination and Wi-Fi password of a lot of Redemption Church's things. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, actually. But this quote is from his book, Prophetic Imagination. Again, imagination signaling like our ability to conceptualize what kind of world we're living in, who we are, who God is, what God's up to. He says, the royal consciousness leads people, and what he means by that is the empire. When I say empire, that's what he's saying. The royal consciousness leads people to numbness. He says the empire specializes in economics of affluence, a politics of oppression, and a religion of eminence in which God is co-opted to serve the interests of the present order. He says this in a different way, actually. If you get a chance, you should. Tim did a podcast interview with Walter Brueggemann. You can find it on our website, actually. I can send it to you if you want it. I think he says, maybe it's in the B-roll, actually, but I think it's in there. He says that without the Old Testament, without the story of the people of God, you can actually make Jesus fit any ideological purpose you want. And it disturbs me a bit, especially as I read the story and he's like, Jesus started with Moses and told them the story. He gives them the framework, the understanding of how to understand Jesus, right? The royal consciousness leads people to numbness. The empire specializes in economics of affluence, a politics of oppression, and a religion of eminence in which God is co-opted to serve the interests of the present order, our current assumptions about how the world works. Right? And in the Gospel of Luke, the writer is relentless on this point. And let me just show you. Luke 1. He has brought down rulers, says Mary, from their thrones, lifted up the humble, filled the hungry, sent the rich away empty. Luke 4 is the announcement of the good news to the poor, freedom for prisoners. By the way, this is the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew says poor in spirit. Luke says just good news to the poor. Doesn't say he's poor in spirit. Interesting. Freedom for prisoners, sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, the year of the Lord's favor. That's Jubilee language. Luke 6 is a Sermon on the Plain. He comes back and says, blessed are you who are poor. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the Sermon on the Plain. Hungry, those of you who are weeping. Blessed are you who are rich, who are well fed. Or woe to you who are rich, who are well fed, who are laughing. Like, okay, chill. That's all. I mean, the middle of the gospel, Luke is like hammering this again. Luke 7. Here are the signs of the kingdom of God in our midst. The poor, the blind, the lame, the lepers, the deaf, the dead, all the people the empire discards. Luke 10, the Good Samaritan story crosses every boundary empire is enforcing. Luke 11, you neglect justice and the love of God. Luke 12, the parable of the rich fool. Luke 13, the bent woman healed on Sabbath. Jesus calls her a daughter of Abraham, who Satan has kept bound. Again, this like liberation language. Luke 14, don't invite the rich to dinner. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Luke 14, the kingdom is like a great banquet. The elite don't come. The poor and outsiders fill the table. Luke 16, rich man and Lazarus, one of the wildest stories about exactly what we're talking about. Luke 18, the persistent widow and the unjust judge. This is justice for the oppressed against corrupt use of power. Luke 18, again, the rich young ruler. Ever heard of it? Great story. Luke 19, Zacchaeus receives salvation because of a restoration of an economic restoration of things that he stole in his acts of corruption. Luke 20, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. What isn't God's? Luke 21, the widow's offering of 2 coins is greater than all other gifts because it's all she had. And then the final week, Luke 23, I'll be honest with you, I don't think I even knew exactly that in the Bible they have the charge that Rome laid against Jesus to do this. I don't know why I thought. Sorry, maybe I just didn't know it was there. Luke 23, the charge against Jesus at trial was this: subverting our nation and opposing payments of taxes to Caesar and claiming to be king. Rome understood exactly what Jesus was doing. Luke 24, our story today. We had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. That word redeem is liberation language. Remember, ransom, release. They were waiting for exactly what Luke 4 had promised from the very beginning. And so the arc is Luke opens with liberation songs, announces liberation as Jesus' mission begins, demonstrates it in healing and parables throughout the middle of the gospel, and Rome confirms this reality at his death with the charge they lay against Jesus. And then it ends with two followers walking away from Jerusalem, devastated, because they thought Jesus was going to liberate Israel. But instead of killing the empire killed the Messiah. Verse 30 is when the numbness falls apart. Verse 30. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he disappears from their sight. Okay, that's crazy. That's wild. You could do like a whole sermon on that right there, but they asked each other, were not our hearts? I think this is the line that when people hear the Emmaus story, they just respond to it. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? In other words, when we were like getting into it and fighting, weren't we just like alive? Wasn't that amazing? And the reason I wanted to give you this whole rundown of the Gospel of Luke is because I'm trying to show you this morning that what broke these travelers free was not any one event. This wasn't a magical moment of conversion. Luke is doing something way cooler here. And I want to break this down for you. The story of Emmaus begins with these travelers talking and being together. So I'd like you to imagine this morning, they're out in our atrium. The travelers are just out here talking and being together. Then they go through a kind of confession of their suffering. They're sharing their life with each other. We've probably done this. You've probably done this here at church all the time. Like, hey, how you doing? And somebody's like, I'm actually really struggling today. And then they engage in debate and conversation. They're really in it. It's not just like, I'm here. We're actually like kind of connecting. And then they listen to a sermon from Jesus. Jesus teaches them the story. And then they have a meal. And Jesus offers the communion liturgy to them. They confess again after communion, and they leave communion, Eucharist, and participate in the mission of God by announcing and enacting the story of Christ in Jerusalem. I think the story actually is like this container symbol of church, of the liturgical practice of the early church. I wonder if this is not like a story that contains within it an alternative community and practice. But if we read Luke 4, it's organized around giving sight to the blind, setting the prisoner free, announcing the year of Jubilee. And this is the story that is the bridge between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And I think what is happening here is Luke is embedding the thematic movements of church life into the Emmaus story that is in turn embedded into the entire story of Jesus, which Jesus, of course, is embedded in the culture and history of Israel, which is in turn embedded into the socio-political landscape of the relationship between Israel and empire throughout all time, let's start with Moses. This is a story that is not only making the church, but I think the road to Emmaus is also making the empire, right? The story has movements that function like a church service, a liturgy that is working to liberate us by exposing what is in the way of the mission of God. and providing people the hope and the energy to keep working. A dramatic and liturgical reminder that the mission of God did not finalize. This is like key, I think. It's key. A dramatic and liturgical reminder that the mission of God did not finalize at the cross. The mission of God did not come to a close at the resurrection. Of course, the fact of the resurrection is hard to believe. Like, that's in the story. It's in last week's story. It's in the witness of the church. The resurrection is hard to believe. We get this. And you can see that being reflected all over the story. But once you go beyond the fact of the resurrection, you see what the resurrection means to these travelers. In the cross and resurrection, the mission of God to liberate creation has been blown open with radical possibilities. And I think these two travelers were looking for any reason to hope, any reason at all. Give me something here. Because the Messiah they just saw the Messiah die. They're looking for any reason at all to get back to work. This is what they gave their life to. This is what they want to do. And they had ears to hear, they had eyes to see, but the violence of empire, the news of the day, the way our society is organized, the way we've been brought up, the religion that gets wrapped up in that, it can be traumatizing. It can be overwhelming. The public corruption of empire can make you go crazy, knowing that there are two sets of rules for one group of people and another who are down and out. But the smallest glimpse of Christ, and then he disappears, but that smallest glimpse of Christ and that smallest reignition of that revolutionary flame in their heart is all these radicals needed to jump right back in to doing the work of liberating God's creation from the violence and corruption of empire. For the sake of the reconciliation of all things. That's Colossians. And here's what I think these travelers saw at that tense meal. Here's what I think these travelers saw in conversation with the resurrected Christ. Here's what I think is the radical possibility post-resurrection that showed up in their midst. The resurrection is not just a miracle. The resurrection is a political act of defiance. And it proves that the community formed by Christ is not disbanded. It's not disbanded by the empire's violence, but it's solidified by it. Let me read that again. The resurrection is not just a miracle. It's a political act of defiance. It proves that the community formed by Christ is not disbanded by the empire's corruption and violence, but it's actually solidified by it. Jesus was put to death on the cross by the empire. This solidifies the resurrection and the future. So, let's do what they did. Let's follow the Emmaus liturgy here. Let's face each other. Let's break some bread. Because if Luke is right, this is where we start to see. This is where we start to feel again that flame, that heart burning inside of us. It gives us a reason to get back to work in the reconciliation and the liberation of all things. Let's pray. God, we've all experienced the disappointment of the mission of God. We've experienced the disappointment of unmet expectations and further than that, loss. What have I been giving my life to here? That God did not turn out, that you did not turn out the way we thought you would. That this story did not go the way we thought it was going to go. We've all had those moments where we realize that my motives are participating, or my motives are part of the problem, right? The way I think this is going to go, the way I think this is the story, is going to go. It doesn't turn out that way because my expectations, my imagination it's shaped by something else. And God, I just ask that your Spirit would break into us and remind us and give us a new imagination. You'd make us a new creation from the inside out. That we could see what it is, not just that did the resurrection happen, but what does it mean? What does it mean for us as the people of God here in this neighborhood, in this place? What possibilities are open to us? What hope could burn within us? I also remember times in my life where, I remember my heart burning within me as I felt like I was in the flow of what I was asked and called to be and do in this place, to my friends, my neighbors. And God, I just pray that we would be a people who are about the liberation, about the reconciliation of not only each other, but our neighborhood, the poorest amongst us, the marginalized, the oppressed, and those things about ourselves that we are constantly marginalizing and oppressing just to keep down in a way, because we know the empire does not want to see those things. Those are not useful for the empire. God, I pray that we would have the courage, as the end of the text says, to gather together, to tell the truth about our lives, to be liberated from the expectations of how empire wants us to behave and act, but together to shape a new kind of people, a new way of being, a new story with you and for the world. Amen. Please stand with me. We're going to receive communion together at this time, and we invite everyone who calls on the name of